In the last lecture, we talked about the early development of Luther's ideas, especially salvation by faith alone, and talked about how his ideas really began to reach a wider audience due to the indulgence controversy which he became involved in 1517. And last time at the end of the lecture, we just gone over what indulgences were and how Johannes Tetzel was abusing them and telling people they did things they didn't really do in order to sell more. We picked the story up when Luther hears about this, because the indulgence sale was just really right next door to where Luther lived. Luther hears about what Tetzel's telling people, and he becomes very concerned about the abuse of the indulgence sale. And at first his concern is a very practical one, because as well as being a professor at the university in Wittenberg, Luther was also a parish priest in church in Wittenberg. And as a parish priest, he had care of the souls of his parishioners, and it was his job essentially to help them do the right thing to get to heaven. And he was very afraid that if any of his parishioners went over and bought indulgences and actually believed the things that Tetzel was saying about the indulgences, that they might go wrong in their own religious lives and not go to heaven in the end. For example, Tetzel was saying indulgences did so much more than they really did, and people might believe it. And if they did believe it, for example, people might not feel truly sorry for their sins if they purchased an indulgence. They might feel, well, now I bought this, and this kind of relieves me of being sorry. And Luther knew that if they didn't really feel sorry for their sins, that they couldn't do the step of contrition and confession, and they wouldn't be able to go to heaven. So he was very concerned, and even thought that some people might stop going to confession if they thought they could just buy an indulgence. And all this has to do with the way that Tetzel was misinforming people about what indulgences really were and what they could really do. So that was the immediate practical concern that Luther had. And this shows us something about Luther that I think is interesting. Even though he was a very intelligent and scholarly man, and a very bright man, he was also a very practical man. And in a situation like this, the first thing that comes to him are the practical implications of what he sees to be a problem. Nevertheless, the more he thinks about it, he begins to develop some other objections to the indulgence sale, and these actually become more important in the bigger picture of the indulgence crisis in the beginning of the Reformation. In particular, Luther has some questions about the treasure house of merit idea. That idea that the church put forward, that indulgences work because in the early days of the church, the great saints of the early church had not used up all their merit to get to heaven, had given it to the church. The Pope then took charge of it and could put it in indulgences and sell it to people that way. Luther's objection is not that he didn't believe that there was such a treasure house of merit. What Luther had a problem with was the fact that the Pope had control of it. Luther said, now, if the saints really did leave this merit to the church, that didn't mean they left it to the Pope. And the church is not just the Pope, it's the collection of all the believers. And therefore, this treasure house of merit, all this extra merit, was in fact left to everybody in the church, and everybody has a right to it. And by extension, the Pope doesn't have a right to monopolize it and dole it out to people and sell it, and which is that really calls into question the efficacy of indulgences themselves. And it also is, in a small way, an attack on papal power, because it's basically saying the Pope doesn't have the right to control this fund of merit and sell it to people. So it is a small attack on papal power, although you're going to see that it gets blown up into something much bigger than that when the church hears about it. As everyone knows, Luther wrote down his various objections to the indulgence sales, mainly the abuses, in his famous 95 Theses. He did not nail them to the church door in Wittenberg, as is the popular legend. Instead, he did what I think was probably more logical. He mailed a copy to the archbishop. It just so happens, though, that this archbishop was Albrecht of Brandenburg, the guy behind the indulgence sale. one of the guys. So as soon as the Archbishop took a look at the 95 Theses, he recognized immediately there was going to be trouble from this, and he forwarded the copy down to Rome, to the papacy. And this is the crucial act which is going to lead to Luther's break with the Church. Although we should point out at this stage that Luther had no intention of breaking with the Church. Luther had no idea he was going to break with the Church. What happens from here on out is that Luther is in effect forced by the Church to break from it, and forced by the Church to go his own way. And we'll see in this lecture how that situation plays out. Now, one of the difficulties here was the attitude of the papacy. After the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism, and then the battle with the conciliar movement, the Pope had just recently really regained his position of supreme power in the Church. And he was naturally very afraid, very scared of anything that might appear to be a challenge to his power to rule the Church. And you can sort of understand why he would have been. But because of that feeling the Pope had, you could even call it a kind of paranoia about his position in the Church, the Pope essentially overreacts to what Luther says in the 95 Theses. Because Luther had made only a very small challenge to papal power over the treasure house of merit. And it could have very easily just been ignored, swept under the carpet, forgotten, and nobody would have heard about it. And when you look back, if you were up close to the Pope at this occasion, at least if I were, I probably would have said, look, this guy Luther is nobody. Just ignore him, and he's not going to have any impact. That's not what happens. Albrecht sends the theses down to Rome. They end up in the mailbox of the official papal theologian Sylvester Prierius. Prierius reads them, and he sees Luther's issue about the treasure house of merit as a denial of papal power. And not just a denial of papal power over the treasure house, but in fact, a denial of papal power to rule the Church, the Pope's position in the Church. I guess you could possibly stretch it out and you could say, well, now, if he really doesn't have power in this area, he might not have power in these other larger areas. But that's certainly not what Luther was saying, or even implying, and never intended to say or imply. But that's how it was interpreted. Prierius goes to the Pope. He says, look, this guy Luther is challenging your power to control the Church, to rule the Church. And then the Pope gets all upset. The two talk about it for quite some time and decide to do something which I think in retrospect is really astonishing. They decide that the Pope will issue a couple of official papal decrees claiming things about papal power that have never, ever in the whole history of the Church been claimed before. And this was a huge overreaction to Luther's challenge. It's kind of like taking an artillery piece to blow away an ant. But that's exactly how the Pope was facing it. In the first papal decree, it was declared that the Pope was infallible in matters of faith. Meaning whenever it came to religion, he couldn't make a mistake. He's infallible. Never before claimed. In the second decree, it was claimed that the Pope's authority in doctrinal matters or religious matters surpassed even the Bible. So if the Pope and Bible disagreed about something, the Pope would be right and the Bible would be wrong. Again, unprecedented, never claimed before, and not really even valid under church law, but still these claims were made in a very public way, and the Pope has taken a position which you can only say was extreme in reaction to what Luther had done. These claims of papal infallibility and authority made by the Pope in these two decrees have the effect, although nobody actually realizes it at first, of changing the whole focus of debate between Luther and the Church. Focusing the debate away from Luther's theological claims onto the issue of papal infallibility, which Luther never thought about, intended to think about very much. Well, what happens next is that Luther hears that the Pope has reacted negatively to his ideas, and Luther, in fact, is saddened by this. He really believes that there can still be a compromise, that he and the Pope can get together, that they can work their differences out, and that they can actually reform the abuses that need reforming, and that there doesn't need to be any big flap about it. And he writes a letter to the Pope informing him of that. Pope writes back, challenging Luther to a debate. The Pope says, I will send my top theologian or debater, and you come to this debate, and we'll simply talk about our differences, and we'll see who's right. Try to work them out. And Luther thought this was a good idea, because that's exactly how Luther, who was a fairly rational man, would react to the situation. The debate was set for the year 1519 in the German city of Leipzig. This is another watershed event in the Reformation, because this is the first time that large numbers of the public actually see and hear Luther in person, because this debate is open to the public. And it's really the equivalent, the early modern equivalent of what would be today putting somebody on television. He's going to become well known to the public because of this. For the debate, the Pope sends his number one debater, Johannes Eck. Luther, of course, comes in person, and they begin the debate. They hadn't really discussed an agenda for the debate, so Luther had always assumed they'd be talking about salvation by faith and other theological issues, but that's not what happens. Well, as it turns out, all Eck wants to talk about in the debate is the Pope's infallibility. And every time he can, he keeps coming back to Luther and he keeps saying, now, okay, but do you think the Pope's infallible? Do you think the Pope can make mistakes? And Luther hadn't even considered this question, really. He didn't know what to answer to it. He hadn't prepared for it, and he didn't even, he didn't think it was going to be part of the whole process. But Eck kept hammering away at Luther. And Luther was the kind of guy that after a certain point, he could become frustrated, and he could become angry. And that's apparently what happened in this case. After question after question after question from Eck, Luther finally said, well, if you really want me to say something, no, I don't think the Pope's infallible. I think he's a man like anybody else. I think he can make mistakes. So now Luther's gone against the papal decree. Eck further continues the debate by asking about the issue of the Bible versus the Pope. Who's the highest authority? If there's a disagreement, will it be the Bible or will it be the Pope? And again, Luther really hadn't thought much about it, but being kind of badgered into this whole situation, he claims eventually that it was the Bible is the highest authority, and that whatever it says is right, and if the Pope disagrees, then the Pope must be mistaken. Well, the debate sort of peters out after that, but at this point, a break between Luther and the church has become very likely, even though Luther didn't intend it, and he didn't even go to the debate thinking it was going to happen. But it's very likely now that's exactly what's going to happen. Later on, after Luther gives more thought to this, he'll actually make stronger claims, including the fact that papal power to rule the church is a medieval invention and not really decreed by God, and therefore not valid or true. But he doesn't claim that at this point in the debate. It becomes apparent very quickly, though, that once the Pope hears what Luther has said, the Pope has no intention of compromising. Now, whether Luther thought at this stage there was any possibility still for compromise is kind of hard to tell, but the Pope has no desire to compromise. In July of 1520, the Pope issues a bull of excommunication against Luther, essentially throwing him out of the church, and the reason for it was Luther's denial of papal power. No mention was made of salvation by faith alone, Luther's core idea. So you can see how the papacy sort of set the agenda for this debate, directed how it was going to come out, and then